The color red. The pond was their life source. It was everything to them. For without water, we all die. And it was the same for them, because they are us, and we are them, human. It was their job to stay in the cabin in the winter. It was a resort in the mountains, but only during the summer, when it was accessible. For during the winter, the snows piled up so high that no one could get there or back. Not until the thawing came. Just as the ghost scenes of the first snows began to fall, 2 men were routinely dropped off at the cabin with plenty of provisions to last the winter. Outside the small cabin was a pond that would provide the water for the men. 2 large rocks stuck out by the pond in a slight V-shape, casting their shadows onto the water beneath them, and at the other side was a bucket, rigged to a pulley system. The men understood that eventually, as the winter became bitterly cold, they would have to break the ice to get through to the water, but that was nothing new. That was just protocol. And each day, they were to chop the necessary wood to keep warm, and to keep the stoves in the other cabins warm as well, to avoid pipes freezing and bursting, which could cost hundreds of dollars of repairs for the privately owned resort. They were woodsmen, and always had been, and every winter they were brought up to the cabin to do what they did best, chop wood. To survive themselves, they too would have to chop. Chop, chop, chop. The rusty old truck bumped up the road, and the men huddled together for warmth. Each of them wore a large coat and long caps lined with fur and flaps that came down and buttoned under the neck. Already biting cold, and it's barely coming down. Just haven't acclimated to it yet. We'll be fine. You do this every year? Yeah. There was a new kid with them, just coming up to help unload supplies. His name was Roger. Not even 16 yet. He sat huddled next to the 2 men in the back seat, the flaps of his cap pressed tightly down over his head. Does it get much colder than this? Much colder, kid. The big burly man next to him laughed. This is just the beginning. Last year we had to pound through about a foot of ice before we could even get to some fresh water. The kid looked at them in disbelief. He knew nothing of the world outside of his little town. This year we figured we'll just start a fire straight on the pond. The kid's mouth dropped open. Really? Yeah, no one else is up there. Who will care? It's a lot faster than trying to pound a blasted hole through it, especially after chopping wood for an entire bloody day. Both men nodded, and the kid stared at them in wonder, mouth slightly open. The 2 men up front looked at one another and smiled, but did not say anything as they puttered along the mountain road to the cabin. The main cabin came into view as they turned a corner. That was the cabin by the pond where the men would stay. Main cabin was probably a gracious name for such a small thing, big enough for perhaps a family of 4, though there was only one large room with a kitchen as part of it, and then the bathroom seemingly tacked on to the back of the house. Next to it, off to the left, rose the boulders that formed the edge of the pond, and there on the other side, the bucket swung slightly back and forth on the rope holding it. Every now and again, as the wind blew harder, it would knock into the wood, making an empty hollow sound. Whack, whack, whack. All the men got out as the driver parked the truck, leaving the motor running. The men all stomped their feet as they got out, trying to keep warm and get circulation back into their toes. The little one, the boy, put his hands under his armpits and hopped back and forth from one foot to another. All right, boys, let's do this quick. And in minutes, the truck had been unloaded, with all the provisions for the upcoming months stacked in boxes on the ground before the cabin. The 2 men staying there knew there were also more provisions inside that were always kept there for the winter dwellers, as they called themselves. Blankets, canned goods, some meat in the freezer, cards, a bit of rum and whiskey stored in a cupboard. The usual. Everything a man or 2 would need to survive a winter. Thanks, Mac. Thanks, Jerry. The 2 men hugged the others, then turned to the kid that had tagged along. Thanks, Roger. Be a good kid for your mom, all right? All right, he shouted enthusiastically as he climbed into the back of the truck. There was a lot more space now. It wasn't as warm. Luck, Matthews. Good luck, Smith. The men raised their arms in goodbye as the truck drove away, and once it was gone, they both looked at each other. Well, we better get these inside. Matthews jerked his head in the direction of all the boxes. Smith just nodded, and on they went. As the snow continued to gently fall, powdering the ground, the 2 men hacked away at the woods around them, felling trees, one after another. Chop, chop, chop. Matthews paused for a moment to adjust his gloves, and a cold wind whipped by. He shivered. pulling his collar up higher around his neck, then stomping his feet and pumping his fingers a few times before bending down and picking up the axe again. Chop, chop, chop. The woods around the men creaked, and the sound of water rippling, lapping at the shores of the pond was distantly heard. The air was crisp, but not too cold. It would warm up as the day progressed. Getting through the mornings was always the hardest thing to do. They were always the coldest, and just overcoming the task of starting the work is what usually took the longest. At least it was just day one. Day one was always easier because there was new energy and vigor, new adventure. But soon, the new adventure would become old. The woods would be the same, the walls of the cabin would be the same, every creak and moan of the trees would be the same, and the monotonous chop, chop, chop of the axe would be the same. The weather was getting colder with no signs of warming up. It was good that they had come up when they did, for now there lay a foot of snow over the ground with more coming down. Each cabin was checked to make sure nothing had broken. Sometimes they had to take long brooms and sweep snow off the top of the roofs, because the owners worried the roofs would cave in. Once each cabin was checked, the men began chopping, and once that was done, it was back to the cabin. Over and over and over. An endless cycle of chop, chop. Matthews had practically memorized the lines in the walls now. He had been staring at them for so long. Curse winter for coming this soon. They had already played every two-person card game known to man at least 3 times, had run out of stories and jokes to tell each other, and still had at least a good few months before any sun would shine, allowing any other human company to come up to the cabin. The creaking of the wood was getting on his nerves. Every time the wind blew and cut straight through the wood in unseen holes, it made him shiver and pull in tighter to himself. He ground his teeth. The constant, unending noise was enough to fray a man's nerves to the end, where they would eventually just snap. Ready for some more chopping? Smith's hand came down on his shoulder. Matthews grunted and stood. A few days before the snow had begun to melt, and then it returned, but now there was no more than a few inches on the ground. It made walking easier, and Matthews listened to the crunch of it under his boots. Smith had begun to talk more as the days had gone on. Perhaps he did it when he was lonely or when there was no one there to talk to. Matthews didn't know. He tried to drone him out as the man told the same story about his grandma and the sheriff for the 3rd time. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Chop, chop, chop. Well, I'll be working over here, he said, suddenly stopping. All right, I'll keep going. Holler if you need me. Matthews dropped the axe down and watched Smith go, then sighed, stretching his back and looking up at the sky. It was gray, always gray, forever gray, until that fateful day when the blue would finally break through and the sun would bathe them once more in its graceful light. He picked up the axe and began chopping, forever chopping. The noise ingrained into his head, the movements a part of him, over and over again without thinking. He moved from one tree to another. Nearby, he could hear Smith chopping, and then he began to talk. But Matthews didn't care. He was just lifting, raising, swinging, whap, pulling back, lifting, raising, swinging, whap, lifting, raising, swinging. Smith's face floated into view. What is he doing here? Whap! One with the axe, one with the movement, over and over again without thinking. There was screaming now. Whose screaming was it? Lift, raise, whap. Lift, raise, scream. Whap, scream. Now something else was there too, breaking through Matthew's cloudy and narrowed vision. It was red, all red. Lift, raise, whap, scream. Red, pull back, lift, raise. The screaming had stopped, but the red was still there. Lift, raise. Matthews faltered. His vision, which had clouded in the moments of his work, now flooded back to him, and when it did, he stumbled back in horror, his axe dropping on the ground and his arm coming up to cover his face, as if by covering it, he could blot out what he had seen, and what he had done. Had he done that? But no. But how? But who else? The steady raise, swing, whap, pull. It was also natural. He didn't have to think about it. Raise, swing, whap, pull, over and over and over. He turned around thinking he was going to retch, and he did, until there was nothing left. Then he turned back. Smith lay there, on the ground, his axe a few feet away by the tree he had been chopping. His body was red, covered in red, and he must have tried to crawl away in the last moments as Matthew's axe had come down. Whap! What had he done? What had he done? He frantically looked around. No one else was there. There was no sound except for the wind and the trees moaning. The branches seemed to come down over him, enclosing him in a cage. Oh no, oh no, oh no, oh no. Smith moved, just an inch, and groaned. Matthews screamed and picked up his axe again, moving forward. Maybe Smith's arm came up one last time. Matthews wasn't sure, because it was just more red with every whap. And then it was silent. This time, there was no wind. Breathing hard, Matthews doubled over, catching his breath before standing up straight again. He was fine. I am fine, he said out to the world. No one answered. No one could. He was alone. I am alone. No one else was there. No one else is here. He looked around, and then he looked down at the body. He stepped gingerly over it to the tree Smith had been working on, and picked up the abandoned axe. Raise, swing, whap, pull. Raise, swing, whap, pull. Soon the methodical chopping sound filled the air once more. A neat pile of logs lay before Matthews, all stacked up and ready to go, but the sled was back home and he was tired. He didn't want to have to come back and move them tonight. As he turned, his eyes caught sight of the body. A small covering of snow had dulled some of the red tones, staining the snow, but the twisted and mangled body was still visible. Something has to be done about that, he thought. The red, it sort of looked nice. A change of color, not the pure white, the dirty smudgy white, or the gray, but red, brilliant red. He put the axe down. He could come back for it tomorrow, and instead went over to Smith and gently brushed the snow from his body as if he was handling a most delicate and prized item that could not be disturbed or ruined. Red. So red. His head cocked as he looked at it. And then he picked it up. It was already stiff and heavier than expected, but he couldn't leave it there. That would be wrong, he said, as he hefted the body on his shoulder and began his hike back to the cabin. Smith's body sat outside, propped up against the side of the cabin. Inside, Matthews was making soup. He delicately chopped the vegetables, making sure not to get his knife close to his fingers, and then threw them in a pot of boiling broth. He began to whistle. After coming home, he had cleaned his clothes. He did not want the red that was all over them. That was for Smith, and for the clearing they had been in, for those two places alone, but not for him. The beauty of the red color against the gray and white that was his world now was reserved only for them, but he himself could not partake, only look at it and wonder. He had had to boil water to take a bath to rid himself of the color that he was not fit to wear, and while waiting, had attempted to clean his clothes in water drawn from the pond, while Smith had watched. Matthews had been sure to place Smith facing the pond. He would like that, he said to himself as he set the body down. He liked the pond. We both do. Then he had laughed to himself and gone inside. Now he was eating the warm soup, having rid himself of the color red. It had not been so easy to do with his clothing, so he had shoved them all away in the back corner of a cupboard, wrapped in a blanket. They were still wet. Tomorrow he could take them out to Smith and put them on him. He was allowed to carry the color red. It looked so well on him, too. As he looked out the window, he saw the moon reflecting off the pond and the snow slowly falling. It was quiet. Everything was quiet. Snap! Matthews jerked awake, fumbling around for anything to protect himself before realizing he was not in his dreams, but in the real world, in a warm cabin under a pile of blankets on the floor with the sun shining through the windows. His dreams had been filled with sounds of chopping and screams in red. So much red. I must have slept in unwittingly, he said, stumbling to his feet, casting his blankets to the floor. He yawned and began to brew a pot of coffee, looking around the cabin. I'd best get some water, he said. Then, where is Smith? Why didn't he wake me? He quickly donned a coat, boots, and gloves, and walked out of the house to the side and rounded it. Smith was there, though slumped over as if someone had come along and pushed him in the night, trying to wake him, only to discover that he was long gone, and then they had run away in fear. Why didn't you wake me? Matthews said as he grabbed Smith by the shoulders and straightened him. He suddenly remembered the clothes he had to give him. And the water forgotten, he ran back into the house, calling over his shoulder, Wait a moment, I have something for you. He dashed madly inside the house and leaned down to the cupboards, yanking them open and pulling out the blankets and food. The clothes weren't there. Where are they? He growled and pulled more and more blankets and supplies out, casting them to the floor, heedless of the mess he was making. Where? He was almost frantic in his search now. Where were they? Then there, back in the corner of the last cupboard. He must have forgotten where he had placed them. Quickly he grabbed the blanket and unrolled it, then gently picked up the clothes and, as if carrying a small child, brought them out to Smith. "To help keep you warm," he said, smiling, and laid them over his friend. "There." And he stepped back, satisfied with his work. Then his smile faltered as he saw Smith's face. The eyes were dead, yet malicious, not fearful as they had been the day before. And the smile. Could it have been bigger today? "Stop smiling!" he suddenly shouted. "I don't like it. I don't like it at all." And he shifted nervously from foot to foot, looking down to the ground like a child who has been caught and cannot meet their parents' eyes. Then he muttered, "I have to get water," and shuffled towards the pond. The smile still leered at him as he walked by. He wanted to look. The color still there, though going darker as it froze, was beautiful. But the smile was so wrong, and it haunted him. He kept looking up to catch a glimpse of the red, then back down at the ground, back up and back down. It was like Smith was watching him, but Matthews didn't want him to know that he was looking at him, admiring that color. With a shudder he turned the corner and entered the house. He had not looked at Smith on the way out to work, had not even gone close. Instead, he had walked around the other side of the cabin to avoid looking at him, muttering to himself and keeping his eyes fixed on the ground. But back out in the woods, doing what he did best, he had quickly forgotten the stare of his friend, the eyes that accused him, and the grin that taunted him. The grin that taunted him forward, so that the fingers could wrap around his throat and end his life as he had his. None of that mattered as he worked. Chop, chop, chop. More wood, chop, 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 meant more life, and chop, 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 more money. As he returned to the house, his worries forgotten, standing tall, he decided he had better say hello to his friend and see how he was. "Hello, Smith." The grisly face grinned at him, and he jumped back. Immediately his posture changed to that of a cowering man. No, 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 he muttered to himself. "I don't like it. I don't like that at all. Stop it! Stop it! Stop it!" But the stone face would not. "Stop!" he shrieked at the top of his lungs, and looked wild-eyed from side to side. "You can get out here. You are free. You could just stand up and take me. Isn't that right? Leave any time, huh?" The face gave the same smile in response. "Can't let that. No, no, no. No, no, no. I will not let you get to me. You hear? You will not get to me. You will not get away." And he ran to the body, gathering it in his arms as best as he could. It was so stiff and heavy. He marched to the pond. For a few moments he stood there staring. A thin layer of ice had formed over it. That morning he had had to smash a hole through it with his foot just to get water, and he stood staring at its almost transparent whiteness. Then he threw the body down. The weight of the body crushed through the thin ice, and for a moment it seemed to sink to the bottom into blackness, before it bobbed back up, his smile leering out at Matthews, who moved back from the edge of the pond. "There, try to escape that." And he made an about face and marched back inside, his back once again straight. The red would not escape him. The water still tasted fine. He went out and drew it up from the pond every day, and watched as the ice grew thicker and thicker over the color red. It was still there, the color and the body, so beautiful, so different, and captured forever in the ice. He had had a horrible dream. The ice was cracking, and the arms were coming out to get him, bloody red arms, and a smiling face. He screamed. Matthew sat squatting at the edge of the pond. He was supposed to be out chopping wood, but could not after the dream he had had. What if the red disappeared? He had to make sure that it would be okay, that it would stay there and be safe. Against the harsh white of the solid ice, the red looked so bright and lively. Underneath the surface was Smith and his face. If he sat at that angle between the two rocks on the shore of the pond, he could see it. Just fine. Just perfect. For almost the entire day he sat there watching. At one point he heard cracks and almost rose, fearing the red was coming through for him. But when nothing happened, he settled back down to watch. The water had started to taste weird. The ice was thicker, but still thin enough for him to smash through it if he gave it a couple of good whacks with a pickaxe from the cabin. He wondered if the red was tainting it, getting inside of him. What was happening there beneath the surface? He had to see. Gingerly, he circled to the other side of the pond, then stepped out onto it There was a creak, but the ice did not break. Kneeling, he put his face right up against the ice and cupped his hands around his eyes. Ah! He jumped up and stumbled back, tripping over his own feet and landing with a thump in the snow. The face had been there, the tortured face that was still as it was the day he had done it. And the smile was still there. His heart was racing, and he stayed laying on the snow, watching the lake with fear. But when nothing happened, he sat up, then slowly crawled towards the pond and back out onto the ice. This time when he looked, he was ready, and this time he did not jump back. Instead, he stared down at the face and began to take it apart mentally. Instead of being a face, it became separate parts, detached from the whole, and yet wholly entrancing and captivating in their own right. Matthews stayed there with his face pressed against the glassy surface of the lake, creating his own art, until he realized he could no longer feel his face or his fingers. Then he slowly pulled back and stood and looked at the gray world around him and smiled. Life is beautiful. He picked up his axe and headed off to work. There were sounds now and shadows that haunted him. Was it because he kept drinking the water? Because the red was inside of him and he was not worthy of it? Worthy of its beauty? Matthews knew, as all the caretakers did, that there were miscreants and those who liked to come up and ruin the cabins. They would make messes inside, put out the fires, and then start others in the most annoying of places. Some came up and knocked out windows or simply stole things, spray-painted graffiti on the sides of the cabins. But that happened only during the summer. How would they get up here now? He did not know, but he knew that they were there. Almost every night, his sleep was interrupted by noises of people moving around outside, and every night he would get up, see them out the window, and run out to scare them away. Get away! How did you get up here? They would run, and he would chase them, but then they would be gone. Where did they go? Into the snow, perhaps? He thought. And then one came during the day, as he was chopping. He used to get bored of chopping because it got monotonous. But now he viewed it as a burden that took him away from the red. Whenever he was not there, he was by the pond, gazing at the red that seemed to have spread out farther and farther. He thought maybe one day it would reach him, and then he too would be red, taken up in it, wrapped in it. What would it feel like to be the red? As he lifted his axe one more time, he caught the glimpse of the man, out of the corner of his eyes, and turned. There it was, at the edge of the clearing, some figure in a black hoodie with his hands in his pockets and the hood up so Matthews couldn't see his face. Hey, you! It did not react. What are you doing here? He began to run towards it. You're not allowed here. Get out of here. Get! Once a brawny and robust man, Matthew's figure, as it ran across the clearing, now looked gaunt and thin. But he had not recognized that. The red was too important. That was all that mattered. Get away from here! You can't be here! His voice was reaching levels of hysteria. Get! And then he faltered and raised his hand to protect himself, his axe dropping on the ground. The figure had raised its head, and inside the blackness of the hood, all he had seen was red. This soon? He thought as he stumbled to the ground. It came for me this soon. As he lowered his arm, he thrust his head back, baring his throat, ready to embrace it, ready for the tendrils to wrap around him and take him away from the gray world he lived in, to the world of the red. But nothing happened. His eyes cracked open, and the thing stood above him looking down, or at least, that's what he thought. There were no eyes to show in which direction the gaze could be looking. Why are you waiting? He whispered. What is wrong? What is wrong? The person looked up, past him, over his shoulder, back in the direction of the pond, and Matthews followed the gaze. There was nothing there, nothing out of the ordinary, yet a sudden panic gripped him, and he knew he had to leave. The red, he whispered, and then screamed, The red! He stood, slipped in the snow, falling hard, and then stood again, running back towards the pond as fast as he could, his axe forgotten, the flaps of his hat flapping wildly out, and his breath coming out and in, quick puffs. The red, the figure, it did not follow him, only turned and disappeared as the man left the clearing. The red, don't leave me! He slipped again and cursed. What was wrong? What was the sudden panic that was taking hold of him? He skidded as the pond came into view, and then he was running, slipping, on his hands and knees. crawling as fast as he could towards the pond. Tears slid down his face. He did not know why, and snot ran from his nose, but he did not bother to wipe it away. The red! The red! Don't leave me! Don't leave me! He screamed to the wind. And then he was there, in between the rocks, crouching on the ground, crying. He could see the body. It had not moved. It was trapped under the ice now, thick ice, but he could see it, the body, the smile, and the red. Everything was still there as it should be. He let out his breath and rolled himself into a little ball, still weeping, and rocked back and forth, muttering to himself, "No, no, 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 no." He sniffed a few times before looking out again at the water, pulling tighter into himself. Okay, I won't leave you." He rocked back and forth. "I won't leave you." The roof seemed to sag under the weight of the snow that had piled up on it over the last few months. Looking at the amount of snow piled upon it, it seemed like a miracle that there had even been a snap in the harsh weather long enough for something to thaw and for the truck to get up the perilous mountain road. "They should have swept that off," grunted Mac. "Yeah, they usually do. Getting lazy this year, I suppose." "Happens to the best of us," Jerry sighed. The truck stopped and they all hopped out. 2 men, plus the boy. Even though the sun was shining and things were beginning to melt with a steady drip, 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 the boy was cold. He shivered. "Well, where are they?" "Out working, I'd guess." "I don't hear any." "Hello!" Max shouted, cupping his hands. "Hello, hello!" Cold wind whipped by in answer. Roger began to speak. "Maybe—" "Shh!" Jerry cocked his head. "Do you hear that?" There was a knocking, something against wood, like an axe against a tree. Chop, chop, chop. It came and went with the wind. Chop, chop, chop. Then there was a slosh, a bit of water up against the hard surface. Chop, chop, chop. "Hello!" Both men called simultaneously. The kid walked around nervously and approached the house. He found the source of the knocking. "Hey, guys!" he called as the other men milled around and whispered to each other. "It's just the axe." Outside the house by the door, an axe was hanging upside down, lightly knocking back and forth against the wall as the wind blew. "Well, where are they?" The men walked up to the house. Both were now nervous. "Oh, hey!" Jerry turned and caught sight of the boulders by the pond. "Those guys," he muttered. "All right, come on out. We can see you." The shape between the boulders did not move. "Ah, hell." They all walked forward towards the pond. "Come on! We see you! Come on! Oh, Both men stumbled back and Mac turned to shield the kid. "Go wait by the truck! Go wait by the truck!" But it was too late. The kid's eyes had latched onto the body, and he stood stock still, with fright and horror. Mac stepped forward, turning the kid around. "Go back to the truck." But he wouldn't move. "Now come on." The man led him by the shoulders to the truck. By the time he got there, he could already feel the kid's shoulders shaking. He was in shock and crying. He couldn't help himself. After he lifted him into the truck, Mac walked back to the pond where Jerry was kneeling, hands on his knees, facing away from the body. "You all right?" Jerry retched. "I think I'll be okay." "Good," Mac said gruffly, then moved forward. There was Matthew's body, squished between the rocks looking out onto the pond. The skin was shriveled and drawn tight. It looked like he had starved to death, staring out there at the pond. What the hell happened, Mac thought. Why didn't he move? Where is Smith? What the hell happened here? Then he looked beyond Matthews, to the pond. All he saw was red.